All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, to thank Josh and Becca Friedman for dedicating all the Shurim and Droshos this month. Le'ilei Nishmas, Josh's father, Yisrael Yehuda, Ben Rav Chaim Rafael Zichrono Livracha, to thank Sammy and Malka Esterson for dedicating all the Shurim this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib Ben haKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avraham, Hinda Bas Henoch Efraim, and in the schus of the continued Gezunt and Haslacha for Mr. Esterson Admeh Ve'esrim Shanim Tovos. Thank the Pepper family for dedicating the Shurim this month in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Yosef Pepper, Yosef Dovid Ben Yaakov. To thank our Week of Learning sponsor, Steve Galaskov, in commemoration of his father's first yahrzeit, Shama of Nachum Sender Ben Meshulam Nasan Shaban Aliyah, and the family Ein Nechama. And to thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Eyal and Sarah Steinberg, for dedicating the Shurim this week in the schus of a continued refuah for Shulamis Bas Susha. We'll say with that, let us begin. Thank all of our sponsors for all the incredible generosity and sponsorship. So we'll say with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Nun Beis 52, and we are picking up Emir Hashem at the Gemara on Nun Aleph on Beis 51b. We left off 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 lines up from the bottom. So also, if you remember again, the theme of these Mishnayos, we're essentially going, it's the same theme. The same theme throughout all of them, which is the Mishnah essentially giving me two different cases, right? So, for example, the principle that we're illustrating in each of these Mishnayos is Nedarim holchin achar lashon b'nei adam. When a person makes a neder, in terms of how we understand or define that neder, we look at how the word is colloquially used. So what's interesting about these cases in the Mishnah is, let's just use the last example we have in the last Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, for example, if a person makes a neder min hatzli, right? I take a neder that I'm not going to eat from tzli. So we'll say, so again, we look at how the word tzli is colloquially used. Tzli is usually used to refer to meat. Therefore, again, the neder tells me that a person can't eat roasted meat. As opposed to if a person goes ahead and says a more expensive term, like tzli sha'ani toeh, right? I make a neder that I'm not going to taste any tzli. So that's a more expansive term. And in that context, tzli ultimately refers to anything that is roasted. And that becomes the theme. So if you say, or mina kavush, right, that which is pickled, so again, that's going to refer to vegetables. Konam, I'm not going to taste anything that's pickled. That refers to anything that's pickled. So that's the theme of all of these Mishnayos. So says the Gemara. So with that Tanya, let's pick up with this. So Tanya says the Gemara, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Omer, dag shani toim. If a person makes a neder and he says, I'm not going to eat dag, right? Or I should say, the neder is, I will not taste dag. Asr bigdolim, umutter biktanim. He's prohibited to eat big fish, permitted to eat small fish. Apparently the word dag is colloquially used to mean big fish. Okay. Daga sha'ani toim. But if a person says, I'm not going to eat daga, so that the feminine form, asr biktanim, umutter bigdolim. Ultimately, he can't eat small fish, but he can eat big fish. Also, again, so there's no lumdus over here. This is just talking about how these words, how these terms are normally used. Daga shani toy. What happens if a person, lashon of his neder, says daga, right? I'm not going to eat daga. Then I'm not going to taste these. What's the halacha? Asr ben gidolim ben ketanim. Can't eat big fish. You can't eat small fish. Beautiful. Good. Amrli Rav Papa Abaye. So Rav Papa said to Abaye, Mimai didag shani toim gadol. So we'll say, let's analyze this for just a bit. How do you know this, right? How do you know the lashon of dag shani toim, right? This dag that I'm going to eat, or dag that I won't eat. How do you know that dag ultimately means big fish, right? Well, in other words, we're saying dag means big fish, daga means small fish. Just where do you get that from? Now, I will say it's interesting that the Gemara is asking that, because like, what do you mean where am I getting it from? Where I'm getting it from is where? Ultimately, from how people use it. In other words, from how people use the word. That seems to be the theme that we are operating with this entire time. To which the Gemara says, but the Gemara gives an interesting answer from the Papa Abaye, B'may didag shani toim gadol hu dichsiv vayiman Hashem dag gadol livloa es Yonah. Very interesting. I will say, so this one we happen to have a scriptural proof to it. The pasuk says that Hashem went ahead and prepared a large fish to swallow up Yonah. So you see that the lashon of dug, right? Dug is used in the context of gadol, of large. So therefore, again, a person makes a neder not to eat a dug that ultimately refers to big fish and not small fish. We'll say, just interesting as an aside, it says an aside, the Malbim points out on this pasuk, Vayiman Hashem dug gadol, what does it mean Hashem prepared a large fish to swallow up Yonah? So the Malbim quotes the Medrash that says so beautifully that the fish that swallowed Yonah was created during the 7 days of creation, dafka for this purpose. Dafka for this purpose. So I'll say, sometimes in life, something is created and its purpose only becomes known many, many thousands of years later. So this fish, this big fish, was swimming around the sea all of this time. Right? No one knew. Why does the world need such a big fish? What do you need such a big fish for? Until its tachlis became known when it swallowed up Yonah. The point the Malbim makes is that sometimes Baruch Hu puts us in this world to accomplish something, but yet what my accomplishment is, why I'm here, sometimes doesn't necessarily become apparent until sometime later on in my life. Everything in this world serves a purpose. For some things, their purpose is immediately apparent. For other things, it takes a little bit of time to figure out ultimately what the tachlis is. In any event, so the point over here the Gemara is making is that dug means gadol. Says the pasuk, says the Gemara, v'haksiv vayispalo Yonah el Hashem elokav mimei hadaga. But one second, here's the problem. The problem is yes, Gemara, that the pasuk says Hashem, that Yonah davened to Hashem from the belly of the fish, and here we'll say it's used feminine. Daga. We just said before that daga means what? Small fish. But now he's saying Yonah was swallowed up by a big fish, to which the Gemara says something amazing. Lokasha dilma palti dug gadol ubal a dug katan. It's possible that Yonah was swallowed by a big fish, expelled by the big fish, and then swallowed up again by a small fish. I will say, actually, the Malbim again quotes the Medrash that says something so amazing, that this is indeed what happened to Yonah. What occurred? Yonah was swallowed up by the big fish. And what happened? We'll say, what happened when he was swallowed up by the big fish? The Medrash says, nothing. Meaning what? Yonah didn't daven. You have to understand the story of Yonah, which is a profoundly tragic story, is that Yonah was ready to die rather than go ahead and perform his agency of delivering the nevuah to Nineveh. Remember, his job was to go to the city of Nineveh, which was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and deliver a message of tshuva. And in that message of tshuva, the goal was to get the Assyrians to repent. Now, Yonah also understood that the repentance of Assyria, of Nineveh, meant the downfall of Klal Yisrael. Right? In other words, in order to conquer Klal Yisrael, you have to be on a higher spiritual level than the Jewish people. So therefore, again, Nineveh was being uplifted in order to go ahead and conquer Klal Yisrael. So Yonah did not want to go on the mission. He did not, and he was ready to sooner give his life. That's why, again, he's on the boat. The boat is about to capsize. He goes below deck and he simply goes to sleep. He's ready to die. He's swallowed up by the big fish. He doesn't daven. He doesn't daven. Baruch Hu needed Yonah to daven. So we'll say, so what did he do? So he had him, again, the Medrash points out, he has him spit out by the big fish, swallowed up by the small fish. So now Yonah is incredibly uncomfortable. I guess you would think being swallowed up by any fish is uncomfortable. Apparently, again, he was swallowed up by like a 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, big fish. So there wasn't such an urgency to daven. Now he's swallowed up by the small fish, and ultimately he's forced to daven. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, daga means small fish. Ella daga, so the Gemara says, as follows, Ublai dag katan. Ella v'hadaga asher beyar mesa. I'll say, 1 second. Let's go back for just a moment. What about by the Malka of Dam? What happened by the Malka of Dam, right? So the Nile turns into blood, and the pasuk says the fish in the river died. You're saying daga means small. So what does that mean? Kitana mesu, you don't know mesu. So does that mean the small fish died? The big fish did not die? To which the Gemara says, therefore we seem to have contradictory understandings. Amashi, thank you so much. Thank you. We seem to have contradictory understandings as to ultimately, again, what dag means. To which the Gemara says, Ella, daga mashma gidol mashma kitanim. Thank you so much. Rather, again, we'll say what it turns out is that daga means big fish or little fish. Big fish or little fish. U'b'nedarim halach achar lo shomani adam. We'll say here it is again. It's just the same principle But it's interesting that the Gemara feels compelled to go through this exercise, which is just very interesting. But the Gemara says, really, daga could sometimes mean big fish, daga could sometimes mean small fish. When we say, in other words, if you look at the way it's used in Tanakh, sometimes it can mean both. By Nedarim, we go after the colloquial use, and the colloquial use is dag means big fish, daga means small fish. Good. Let's finish up. Hanodra minat sachno. Remember again, we saw that if a person went ahead and made a neder not to eat from tzachno, he is mutter in taris trufa. I'm sorry, he's asher b'taris trufa. Remember again, sachna, the Ran said was dagim kitanim harbe maluchim. This is when you took a lot of small fish and kind of you mixed them together in a dish, salted it, right? Some of them are minced, but the majority of them remain whole. So the Gemara says as follows, Amar li Rabbeinu Rav Ashi, Amar harei alai tzichin mai. What happens if a person says, I make a neder not to eat tzichin? What happens in that circumstance? Tibai. Ultimately, again, that's going to be a teku. Good. Both say that closes out that sugya. New Mishnah on the bottom of 51b, Nun Aleph on the days. Both say, let's begin. Amen. Thank you so much. So the Mishnah says as follows. The Mishnah says, Hanodra min ha'chalav. What's an interesting case? Person makes a neder not to drink milk. What's the halacha? Mutter b'kum. You're allowed to eat whey. W-H-E-Y. Right, so make a neder not to eat chalav. You're permitted to eat whey. Rabbi Yossi says, no, you're not allowed to eat whey. In other words, a neder on milk goes ahead and covers or prohibits whey as well. Minakom, similarly again, if you make a neder not to eat whey, mutter b'chalav, you're permitted to go ahead and eat milk. Shabbos says, so fundamental machlokes, Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanon, as to whether or not milk or whey is included in milk or not. The Rabbanon saying no, therefore neder on milk does not include whey. Rabbi Yossi says yes, it does. However, again, interestingly enough, everyone agrees that whey doesn't include milk. So if you make a neder not to eat whey, that is not going to go ahead and include milk. Incredible. Abishol says, Hanodra min ha'gvino, if you make a neder not to eat cheese, asr ba bein melucha utfela. So what I say, interestingly enough, a neder not to eat cheese essentially covers all types of cheese. All types of cheese. Salted cheese, unsalted cheese, everything is covered. If you take a look at the last Ran on the page, Hanodra min ha'gvino asr ba bein melucha bein tfela. Delotema mepnei sherov gavinos meluchos hein stama melucha mashma. So what's interesting? Apparently, and I don't know how this works today, but apparently, at least historically, the majority of cheeses were salted. So remember again, here's this interesting tension. On one hand, we're saying that b'nedarim halcha achar lashon b'nei adam, right? That in general in nedarim we follow the way words are used in a colloquial context. So the Ran's point is very interesting. Cheese was generally salted. So one might have thought that when you make a neder not to eat cheese, by definition that would include only salted cheeses, but not unsalted cheeses. Kamash Mala, no, that cheese is cheese, and cheese goes ahead and includes all kinds of cheese. Good. Hanoda ben Abasar, interesting case. Person makes a neder not to eat meat, type of nun beis, mutter barotov ubikipa. Very interesting case, I will say. So if you make a neder not to eat meat, you're permitted in gravy and kippah. What's kippah? Take a look at the top Ran on 52a, Fidron Beis Amud Aleph. Barotov ubikipa. Kippah hainu dak shal basar. Surely shulak will say the kippah refers to, I don't know what you technically call this, but like if you're cooking meat, so the kippah is like the shreds of meat that come off, right? The pieces of meat. So remember again, gravy is the liquid, and then the kippah will be like the meat residue that often you have. So here's what's interesting. If you make a neder not to eat meat, Shabbos say apparently again, Nedarim halach achal hashem neder. Look how people colloquially use meat. When people say meat, what are they referring to? They're referring to the piece of flesh, right? To the piece of meat. What are they not referring to? To the gravy, or ultimately to the shreds of meat that come off as well. It's very interesting. Rabbi Huda says no, that's also meat includes everything. right? Meat includes the gravy, and meat includes the kippah, the shreds of meat as well. I'm Rabbi Yehuda. Ma'isa va'asar alinu Rabbi Tarfon. Very interesting about this. Listen to this. Yehuda says there was a story where the following happened. Right? So good. I'm sorry. I'm Rabbi Yehuda. Ma'isa, there was an episode that occurred. Va'asar Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon answered the following. Listen to the case. The beitzim shenis bashlu imo. So we'll say, now, this was a case ultimately again where someone had made a neder not to eat meat. Then what happens? They cooked eggs with meat. And Rabbi Tarfon said, you're not allowed to eat the eggs. Rabbi Tarfon answered the beitzim that were cooked with the meat. So this was the story that was presented. So Amrulo, they said to him, Kain hadavar. Yes, that is true, but when is it true? Emasai, when? Bisman shiyomar basar ze alai. When a person makes the lashon and he says, this meat basar ze is prohibited to me. Shahanodem min hadavar. Why? Because we'll say in general, when you go ahead, first I'll take a look at the Ran for just a moment. The Ran says as follows. So Amrulo, Ba'alei machlokuso shel Rabbi Yossi. Right, those who argue in Rabbi Yossi said as follows, Kain hadavar, kimosha atameyed. So what you're saying is correct about the story of Rabbi Tarfon. However, again, aval ein zuraya shelo aser Rabbi Tarfon ella bizman sh'amar basar zu alai. Dechevan da amar zeh shavye anaf shei chaticha di isura va'aser biyot se mimenu. So we'll say we're gonna flesh this out a little bit more in the Gemara. But what you're saying is the case of Rabbi Tarfon where the eggs became prohibited because they were cooked with meat. What case was this? This was a case where a person said, Basar ze alai, right? A person said, this meat is asr to me. And I will say, when you make a statement, this meat is asr to me, right? What you're saying is, you're making this piece of meat into what we call a chaticha di isura. A piece, like literally again, the piece of meat becomes a matter of a davar of isser, a davar of prohibition. When that occurs, then anything that comes out of the meat is going to be asr as well, including what? Including flavor, including taste. Back to the Ran for just a moment. Since Rabbi say a person said, this piece of meat should be asr to me, that statement makes the meat what we call a chaticha di isura. It's a chaftza of isur. It's an item of prohibition, and therefore anything that emanates from the meat, including flavor, is going to be asur as well. Back to the Mishnah. Shanoda min hadavar v'nis arev ba'acher. If ultimately, again, something is a piece, a prohibited matter, a prohibited item, and then that item gets mixed with something else, im yeshbo b'no same time. If the prohibited item conveys flavor, I will say that's nesinas tam, asr. Ultimately, again, it's going to be asr. So I will say, this is actually a pretty fascinating halacha. Go back to the Ran for just a moment. Shanoda min hadavar, kilomar davar zeh. So I will say, so again, here's what's interesting about this. There are different ways you can be making this neder. A person could say, right, konam basar alai. Meat is asr to me. Okay, that's one way to say it. Or, konam basar zeh alai. This piece of meat is asr to me. So I will say, of course, what's the community between those two prohibitions, between those two nedarim? So one is a neder devolving on a specific piece of meat, and one is a neder devolving upon meat in general. Okay, what the Mishnah is highlighting over here is there's another fundamental difference. When you say this piece of meat, basar zeh alai, what's happened over here is you've transformed that meat into a chaticha di isura. That piece of meat is now a chefza, an object of isser. Because it's an object of isser, anything that stems from it is also asr. Including what? Including flavor. Including what we call in halacha tam. So we'll say, I'll give you just watch how this plays out. At least it sounds how it's playing out right now. If I go ahead and I say, I make a neder not to eat meat. Okay? Then I go ahead and I cook meat, and I cook eggs along with the meat. Right? Are the eggs mutter? Sounds like the answer is that should be yes. Why? Because the only thing I answered upon myself was meat. I can't eat meat. But again, eggs are fine. I was cooked with the meat, that's fine, as long as I'm not eating meat. As opposed to when I say, basar zeh alai, this piece of meat, and I'm focused on a particular piece of meat, this piece of meat is asur to me, and now I cook eggs with that piece of meat. What's the halacha? The halacha is, now again, if the piece of meat gives flavor to the eggs are asur. Why the eggs asur? Because of the meat flavor. Why is the meat flavor problematic? Because since I made that piece of meat into a chaticha di isura, a chafza shal isur, anything that comes from it is asur as well. So if that meat injects flavor into the eggs will be asur. So that's what's happening over here. So when Rabbi Huda retells this story, that one time someone made an neder about meat, and Rabbi Tarfon, and then cooked eggs with the meat, and Rabbi Tarfon says you can't eat the eggs, they jumped in and qualified that. Whoa. That's not always the case. That was a specific case where the guy in question said, Basar ze alai, the meat becomes a chaticha di isura, and therefore you cook it with eggs. If that meat injects flavor into the eggs, that's when it's going to be asur. Shanoder min hadavar. When you go and you make a neder, and you made the neder on a certain object, not in a category. You must remember again, we've seen this, right? Not in a category. You're not making a neder on meat. What are you making a neder on? We're making a neder on this piece of meat. When you make a neder that is item specific, and then that item goes ahead and is cooked with other items, and it's cooked with other items, im yesh b'nosein tam. If halacha l'maisa, the prohibited item injected flavor into the permitted item, asur, then the permitted item becomes asur. We'll say fascinating halacha. Good. Let's go back there. If you take a look at the Ran says, last wide line in the Ran, so the Ran says again, if you take a prohibited item and you mix it in with a permitted item, and the permitted item injects flavor into the permitted item becomes prohibited. So we'll say it's a little bit back to our chulin days, in the end of the last cycle. Remember, again, I will say, the classic example of this would be if you don't have 60 times more eggs than meat. Right? Because remember, again, in general, we assume that taste is batal b'shishim, is negated in a ratio of 60 to 1. So assuming over here I don't have the necessary ratios for bittul, the permitted item will become prohibited because of the newly injected prohibited flavor. Beautiful. So I'll say, so again, just remember this distinction. Person says, meat is asur to me, a generic neder like that. You cook eggs with the meat, the eggs are mutter. You say, this meat is asur to me, assuming that the meat injects flavor into the eggs are asur. Why the distinction? In case one, you're not creating a hefza of isser. So because of that, flavor will not go ahead and impact anything. In case two, you're creating a hefza of isser. Once you get a hefza of isser, anything that comes from that hefza, from that object, is going to be asur as well. Fascinating. Weiter. Hanoter min hayayin mutter b'tafshel sheish bo tam yayin. So again, we'll say same idea. Let's say I make a neder not to drink wine. Konam yayin alai. Wine is asur to me. Okay. Then I will say, what happens if halacha l'maisa I cook something with wine? So what's going to be the halacha? In other words, let's say I cook something right along with wine. So the halacha is it's mutter. As long as I'm not drinking wine. Even if there's wine flavor in something, that's fine. Conversely, Amar konam yayin zeh shani toim. If a person says, this wine is asur to me, and then what happens? This glass of wine falls into a dish, then what's the halacha? V'nafal l'tavshil, im yesh bo b'nosein tam, if the wine injects flavor into the mixture, hareza asur. Ultimately, again, it's going to be asur. So this is now a new dimension in our discussion, right? Remember, again, the Mishnah kind of begins with the same topic we've had, which is, you make an neder from milk. Does that include whey or not? Machlokes Hinda Esterson and Rabbi Yossi. You make an neder from whey, everyone agrees it doesn't include milk. So we'll say, now we've transitioned. Now what we're discovering is something absolutely... So right, you make an neder not to eat meat. Does that include the gravy and the meat shreds? That's the machlokes again, the Rabbanon and Rabbi Yehuda, right? So I'll say, so now what we transition is like this. One more time, then we'll go back there. When you make a neder not to eat of a category, I make a neder not to drink wine, not to eat eggs. Okay, if you then cook wine or cook the eggs with another food, even if the wine or eggs, I'm sorry, I make an neder not to eat meat or not to drink wine, in a general sense, and then I cook other items with the meat or with the wine, even if the meat or wine injects flavor, it's fine, because the neder is only on the direct consumption of meat or wine. If I make a neder, I'm not going to drink this wine, not going to eat this meat, I will say, what's happened? The meat, the wine, that's the subject of the neder, is now what? A chaticha di isura. I will say it's now an object of Isser. Because it's an object of Isser, anything that comes from it, including flavor, is going to be Asr as well. Therefore, if you take that piece of meat or you take that glass of wine and you cook it with other items, if it indeed injects flavor, it will Asr any item it is cooked with as well. Beautiful. We'll say that's the Gemara. Amud Beis. Let's go. Says the Gemara. Or minu. Raise the kasha. Raise the question. Mina adashim. So this is an interesting case. Person makes a neder not to eat lentils. Asr ba'ashishim. You're not allowed to eat ashishim. So we'll say, what are ashishim? Take a look at Rashi. Tab Rashi, left hand side. Mina adashim asr ashishim. Belechem shumu'urav bo kemach shal adashim. Tekasavar ashishim bechlal adashim. So we'll say, this is actually very interesting. So the way Rashi understands it over here is that ashishim is bread that is made from flour that had lentils mixed into it. It will say Tosis, Darash, others explain it as honey fried lentils. Lentils that are fried in honey. Okay? So the idea over here is I'm taking a neder not to eat adashim. So now the Gemara is saying included in that neder is also ashishim. Those are ashishim. We'll call these honey fried lentils. Rabbi Yossi Matir. Rabbi Yossi says, no. The honey fried lentils are going to be mutter. Now we'll say, now what's going on over here? Now look at Rashi once more. Second line in Rashi. So Rashi is like this. Rabbi Yossi Matir. Now we'll say, now what's the pshat? Why does Rabbi Yossi say that the honey fried lentils are going to be mutter? Because Rabbi Yossi will say like this. What are lentils, Rabbi Yossi? What are lentils? Lentils. What doesn't like? When people colloquially talk about lentils, what are they referring to? Good old plain lentils. What are they not referring to? Ashishim. In other words, if a person wants ashishim, they're going to say what? Please pass the ashishim. Right? That's what's going to happen. So we'll say, now, look what's problematic about this. Look at Rashi. Rabbi Yossi says, if you make a neder not to eat lentils, you're mutter and ashishim. Why? They're lo havi bichlal adoshim. Because ultimately ashishim are not included in the category of adoshim. So Rashi says, Kasha Rabbi Yossi, Kasha D'Rabbanan. Both say now we have a contradiction. What's the contradiction? The Ran, if you just go right across in the Ran, you can see the definition. Ashishin, Amr di Yerushalmi, di Inon Talfichi, di Megablon, Umetagnon B'dvash. These are ultimately, again, lentils that are fried in honey. Okay, fine, so go back to Rashi. Remember over here, the Rabbanon are the ones who say that ashishim are included in adashim. Yet, ubasnisin sharu de ka'amri kuma la bichlal chalafu. So we'll say, here's what's interesting. Here's what the Gemara's perceived contradiction is. And out right over here, the Rabbanon are saying that when you take a neder not to eat adashim, that includes ashishim. Yet, the Rabbanon said in the Mishnah that when you make a neder not to go ahead you make a neder not to drink milk, it doesn't include whey. So the Gemara is seeing this as a contradiction, because the Gemara feels over here that what the Rabbanan are saying is when you go and you make a neder not to eat a particular food item, it kind of covers all categories in that food item. So you make a neder not to eat lentils, it includes adashim. If that's the case, then it's contradicted by the Mishnah, because then we should have said, when you make a neder not to drink milk, what should it include? Whey as well. But yet the Rabbanan don't say it. The Rabbanan say a neder not to drink milk doesn't include whey. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi, Rashi says, and again, questions Rabbi Yossi as well. Why? What does Rabbi Yossi say? Over here, Rabbi Yossi says that ashishim are not included in adashim, and yet in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi holds that whey is included in milk. So we'll say this is what the Gemara feels is the contradiction. Because again, which one is it? Do you say that when you make a neder against eating a certain type of food, or against eating food that it includes everything in that category, all the derivative categories, or ultimately not. And I will say, now the truth is, it's not really a fair question. The reason it's not really a fair question, I will say, is because there's such a dramatic difference between milk and whey, right, versus lentils and honey fried lentils. Meaning why? Because I will say, the difference between adashim and hashishim is in a manner of preparation. The difference between milk and whey is that they're fundamentally different items. The fact that ultimately, again, they're derived from the same source does not go ahead and make... But this is the kasha of the Gemara. To which the Gemara says, "Lo kasha," it's not a contradiction. Why? Marki asrei u'marki asrei. I will say, remember again, both the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yossi come from different places. So each one, I will say again, it's always the same principle. But Nedarim halchin achaloshim, and under my Nedarim we go after how people talk. And again, Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan hail from two different places where they spoke in two different ways. Listen to this. The Gemara says, "Bi'asra d'Rabbanan kari lechalba chalba ulekumuk kumuk." In the places, right in the locale d'Rabbanan, they called milk milk, and they called whey whey. In other words, I will say they had separate terms. No one ever called whey milk. So if you never call whey milk, then halacha l'maisa, when you make a neder not to drink milk, it obviously does not include what? Does not include whey. Conversely, ba'ashad Rabbi Yossi, lekuma nami karu lekuma dechalba. Well, here's what's interesting. In the locale of Rabbi Yossi, often, we'll say, you're right, they wouldn't call whey milk, but they would call whey the way of milk. Way of milk. So again, because there was an association between ultimately whey and milk, therefore in Rabbi Yossi's mind, Rabbi Yossi's locale, if you made a neder not to drink milk, it included milk and milk derivatives, which ultimately again includes whey. Fine. So we'll say, so once again, it's just, the Gemara is just reinforcing. And by the way, you'd have to say, it's the same thing over here by the adashim case, right? Ultimately, again, in the Rabbanan's locale, it was common to call ashishim adashim. In Rabbi Yossi's locale, you would not ever call ashishim adashim. And therefore, ultimately, that governs in how they interpret the neder. Beautiful. Tanya, anodim minach chalav muter bekom. We'll see another brisa that kind of parallels the Mishnah. See, here we go. Anodim minach chalav, a person makes a neder not to drink milk. Muter bekom. He's permitted to go ahead and eat whey. Minakum. Person makes a neder not to eat whey. Muter b'chalav. He's permitted to go ahead and drink milk. Minach chalav. Similarly, again, if you make a neder not to drink milk, muter b'gvina. You're allowed to eat cheese. Minach gvina. If you take a neder not to eat cheese, muter b'chalav. You're permitted to eat. You're permitted to go ahead and drink milk. Good. Minach rotov. If you make a neder not to eat gravy, muter b'kipa. You're permitted. Also remember again, kipa is the meat shreds, right? The pieces of meat that kind of fall off. That kind of fall off while you're cooking the meat. Muter b'kipa. Minach kipa. If you make a neder not to eat kipa, muter barotov. Ultimately, again, you're permitted to go ahead and eat the gravy. Im amar basar ze'alai. Now listen to this. Now we're going back. We'll say, by the way, this brisa pretty much just restates elements of our Mishnah. It's a nice summary. Im amar basar ze'alai. But say if a person says this piece of meat is asher to me, as opposed to saying what? Meat in general. So remember again, this is our distinction that we reinforced a number of times in the Mishnah. A person says basar ze'alai. This piece of meat is asher to me. So I'll say before we go on, remember again, what happens when you say this piece of meat is asher to me? Right? You make it a chaticha d'isura, chaftza d'isra. So now the piece of meat itself has become an object of isra. So amar basar ze'alai, asher bo, you obviously can't eat the meat. Ube rotbo, it's gravy. Ube kipo, or it's meat shreds. Right? So in other words, you can't eat anything that comes off of that meat. Similarly, again, if a person makes a neder not to drink wine, general neder, I won't drink wine in general. What's the halacha? Muter b'tavshil sheyesh bo tam yayin. You are permitted to go ahead and eat a cooked dish, even if that cooked dish has wine flavor in it. Wine flavor. Amar konam yayin zeh shanitoy. But again, if you say, I take a neder not to drink this wine, and again, your neder devolves upon a specific glass of wine, and then that glass of wine falls into a cooked dish. So what's the halacha? Ultimately, again, if the wine conveys flavor, ultimately to the cooked dish, then halacha l'maisa it is going to be asur. So I both say, I just want to point out that halacha l'maisa we accept this distinction. Namely, when you make a generic neder, I won't drink wine. So ultimately, again, the only thing that's asur is wine consumption. If something is cooked with wine, even if there's wine flavor, it does not preclude you from eating the food. If you say, I won't drink this wine, I won't eat this piece of meat, and that glass of wine, that piece of meat, gets mixed in with something else, then enachinami, again, if it injects flavor, the originally permitted item now becomes prohibited. Similarly, if you go ahead and you make a neder not to eat meat, general, you are permitted to eat gravy, and you're even permitted to eat the meat shreds, because a neder about meat refers to a piece of flesh, right? A hunk of meat. However, again, if you say, I will not eat this piece of meat, then what? Not only are you not permitted to eat the piece of meat, but you're also not permitted in the gravy or in the meat shreds. Incredible. Mishnah. If a person makes a neder not to eat grapes, right? So again, I make a neder not to eat grapes, I'm permitted to drink wine. I say a neder not to eat olives, mutar b'shemen, I'm permitted to go ahead and use olive oil. We'll say, so once again, it could make sense, because the neder only devolves upon the object itself. In other words, I should say on the category itself. In other words, we'll say, people don't call wine grapes, and they don't call oil olives. So because of that, the neder only devolves upon the grapes. On grapes, only devolves upon olives. Amar, however, a person says, Konam zeisim va'anavim elu shani toing. Let's listen to this. If a person says, olives and grapes, these olives and grapes, right? These olives and grapes that I will taste should be asur to me. Then ultimately again, asur bahen ugiyotse bahen. Ultimately again, I'm asur now in the olives, the grapes, as well as the derivatives from the olives and grapes. So we'll say if you take a look at the Ran, right across on the right hand side, look at this. The Ran writes, Konam yain shein yitoim enough. No, sorry. No, not yet, sorry. We'll get to this. Good. So let's say, so now listen to this. So what's the logic over here? So the logic over here is like this. If you just go ahead and make a neder, general neder, not to eat grapes or not to eat olives, that only covers olives and grapes. Doesn't cover the wine or the oil. But a person makes a lashon, we'll see exactly what in this lashon is problematic. But a person says, Konim zeisim va'anavim elu sha'ani toim. Right? So I will say sha'ani toim sounds like what the Mishnah is saying is, if I taste what? If I taste anything that what? Comes from these olives or grapes, it's asur to me. So that would ultimately again include wine and oil as well. Good. So we'll say, let's go weiter. It says the Gemara. So Baruch Avraham. So we'll say very interesting question. Baruch Avraham. Elu dafka o she'ini toing dafka. So here goes. It's actually quite fascinating. So here's what the Gemara is trying to understand. Right? Let's look at this last case in the Mishnah. Konam zeisim va'anavim elu she'ani toing. Right? That's the lashon. Konam, these olives and these grapes that I will taste. So what's the halacha? Not only can you not eat olives and grapes, but you also can't eat what? Can't eat oil, or can't drink oil and wine. So we'll say, the Gemara says, which phrase is it here that creates the isser, not just on the olives and the grapes, but also on the derivatives? Is it elu, these? And when I say these, also, maybe when I say these, what am I doing? I'm creating a cheftza shel isser. And once I create a cheftza shel isser and olives, and then any derivatives are going to be asur, or is it sha'ani toeh? Is that the phrase? Anything that I taste, which includes ultimately again any derivatives. So I will say the Gemara is just trying to figure out the lashon daf gover means which one is absolutely necessary. Which is the necessary lashon to create the isser upon the wine and the oil. So elu dafka. So I'll say if you say that it's daf, it's the lashon of elu. In other words, when you say zeisim va'anavim elu, these, you're creating a cheftza shel isser, and therefore again the wine and the oil will be asur. Shani toim lamali. So I don't need the lashon of shani toim. Take that out. To which the Gemara says, no. Hakam ashmalon the afal gav the amar she'eni toim. I will say, what is the Mishnah teaching me? That even though if you said she'eni toim, ida amar elu misar ve'ilo lo. Perhaps what the Gemara is trying to teach me, what Mishnah is trying to teach me, is even if you said she'eni toim, right? So any time could be looked at as an expansive lashon. I can't taste anything that comes from these grapes or wine. Maybe that should create. These grapes or olives. Maybe that should create the isser on oil and wine. Kamash lo, no, that's not what creates the isser. You know what creates the isser, Abosai? You know what creates the isser? Elu. That's what creates the isser. When you say these grapes, these olives, that transforms them into a chefza shel isser. And therefore, any derivatives, i.e., the oil and the wine, will be asr as well. So we're still not sure which lashon is it. Is it the elu or is it the she'eni toim that creates the isser on the oil and the wine that comes from these grapes and olives? So Rava says, Tashma konam aperos ha'elu abalai. Person says, this fruit should be konam to me, right? Konam hein lefi, or they should be konam to my mouth. Asr. So we'll say, so again, not only can you not eat the fruit, but you also can't eat whatever the fruit is exchanged for, or whatever, if you replant the fruit, you can't eat the growth. We actually had this sugi before. And we'll say, what do you see from here? It's only chilufein and gidulein that's problematic. Biyotze bahen mutter. But what do you see from here? The derivatives of the fruit. So for example, if you were to juice the fruit, it sounds like that would be mutter. To which the Gemara says, no. Who adin? No, even also the derivatives are going to be asr. I will say ultimately again that the point that the Brace was trying to make over here is that chilufein and gidulein, we've already had the sugya, are just like the primary item itself. So if you have an item that is prohibited by an eder and you exchange it for something else, or you replant it and something else grows, those take on the original status of the item. So Tashma, so we'll say, so again, still haven't answered our question. Remember again, we'll say, what are we trying to figure out over here? A person says, here's the wording. Konam, zeisim, va'anovim, elu, she'eni toim. Right, so konam, these olives, these grapes, right, konam, these olives, these grapes, that I will not taste them. What did the Mishnah say? Not only are the olives and grapes, so what else is asr? The wine and the oil which comes from them. Here's what we're trying to figure out. What creates the derivative prohibition? What creates the derivative prohibition? Is it the word elu, because I said these, transforming them into a chavtza shel iser, or is it sha'ani toim, when I make the assumption of anything I taste? Maybe anything I taste says whatever I taste that comes from these olives and grapes, well, that's which one creates the isser on the oil and the wine. So we haven't been able to answer this. Here we go. So Tashma, she'eni ochal v'she'eni toim. If a person says ultimately again, konam these fruit, that I'm not going to eat, I'm not going to taste, mutter b'chilufein gidulein, you're permitted to go ahead and eat something that this fruit, these items are exchanged for, or again, their growths. So what can you infer from this? Hayotze mehen aser. I can infer as well say that anything that's derived from them, the derivatives, ultimately again is going to be aser. Now it sounds like why should it be aser? Because what is it missing? It's missing elu. So it must be elu transforms it into a chaticha d'isur, a chefza shel isur, which creates the derivative prohibition. To which the Gemara says, no. I be the lo naseh bereisha yotze mehen. No, since the beginning of the Brisa wasn't talking about derivatives from the objects, the Sefer is also not talking about derivatives from the objects. Okay, still no raya. Tashma, Rabbi Yehuda, Ma'aseh v'asur Rabbi Tarfon alai beitz mishnes bashlu imo. Supposed to say, now, Gemara quotes in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda said there was a Ma'aseh, where one time again someone prohibited a piece of meat, and the meat was cooked with eggs. And Rabbi Tarfon says you can't eat the eggs. Can't eat the eggs because again they had meat flavor. Amrulo imasai. So they say back to Rabbi Yehuda. One second. When did Rabbi Tarfon say you can't eat the eggs? When was that? Imasai. Bisman shamar basar ze alai. Oh, we'll say what's the operative phrase over here? Ze. Because what happens when you say ze? It transforms the object into a chaticha d'isur, a chavtza d'isur. Oh. Once it's a chavtza d'isur, then any derivatives from it will be asr as well. Because when you make an eder against something, prohibiting yourself from something, and then it gets mixed with something else, and the prohibited object injects flavor into the permitted object, hare ze asr. ultimately, again, the permitted object becomes aser. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Be'elu lo kayibaylan the dafko. And we'll say, here we go. Everyone agrees that if you want to create not just an Isser Neder, but an Isser Chafza, meaning that you want to create that the object itself is Aser. Now, we'll say, what are the ramifications of making the object itself Aser? What's the ramifications of that? That the derivatives of that object becomes Aser as well. Everyone agrees you need the word Elu. You need the word Eila. Eila or Elu. Ki kami bailan. So we'll say ultimately again. So what's the question? Kimi bailan b'she'eni toim. We'll say the lashon of she'eni toim. Dafka or lo dafka. Ultimately again, the she'eni toim create a derivative lashon or not. Is that necessary or not? So Tashmar will say, here we go. Dogim she'eni toim. Person says, dogim I'm not going to taste. Aser bahem. Ben Gidolim, Ben Kitanim, Ben Chaim, Ben Mevushalim. So I'll say again, you're not allowed to eat big fish, little fish, cooked fish, not cooked fish, umuter b'taris trufa b'tzir, and you're permitted. Ultimately, getting taris trufa, which is when it's minced up, u'b'tzir, we'll say the brine. Now the brine is the stuff that comes from the fish. So Yisir will say that even though what you're saying that halacha l'maisa, right? Lashon over here is dag she'eni toim, and yet even though you said she'eni toim, you're permitted in the brine. Right, in the juice that comes out of the fish, what does that show you? That she'eni toim by itself does not create a derivative isser. To which the Gemara says, no, it's not a good raya. Amarava ukvar yatsu mehen. Rava says that halacha l'maisa, that could be a case of where the brine already came out of the fish. And therefore, again, I will say it's not a good raya. So we'll say, so in other words, the brine came out of the fish before you made the neder. So we'll say, so how do we end off? So here's what we know. When you go ahead and you say, this piece of meat, this glass of wine, Elu creates a chafza shal iser. When it creates a chafza shal iser, anything that comes from the object, flavor, is going to be asr as well. What happens when you just say she'eni toim? Does that create the chafza shal iser? Well, so if you take a look at the Ran, last two lines of the Ran very quickly, uli inyan halacha, the Elu pshita lan the dafkahu va'asr b'yotze mehen. So what the Ran says, when you say Elu or Eila, you've created a Chavza Shal Isser, and therefore again there is a derivative prohibition as well. Anything that comes from that, including flavor, is going to be Aser. The Ran writes, however, Ubishe'eni Toem, Misap Galon, V'lo Ifshatan Bayan. The Ran says ultimately again, when the Lashon of Eni Toem, the Gemara doesn't resolve it. And therefore the Ran says it remains as a suffix. Now, whenever you have a suffix, how is that going to be resolved? L'chumra. So ultimately, again, if you say this piece of meat, everyone agrees this piece of meat ultimately, again, refers to the meat itself, the gravy, the flavor. If you go ahead and you just say this piece of meat that I will not taste, what level of prohibition does that create? That's ultimately unresolved machlokes, and therefore will rule l'chumra. I will say shkoyach. All right, everyone, Zoom Shkoyach, everyone, and good Shabbos.